Tokyo, late autumn 1941. A cold wind drifts through the corridors of the Imperial General Headquarters. The air smells faintly of ink and cigarette smoke. Inside a dimly lit strategy room, a dozen officers sit motionless, their eyes fixed on a table of black and white photographs. The images are of Pearl Harbor, American battleships gleaming under the Hawaiian sun. The fleet looks enormous, almost arrogant in its calm. General Osami Nagano leans forward, tapping a finger on one photograph. His voice, low but firm, breaks the silence. "Here lies the heart of American power," he murmurs. "If we strike it down, the Pacific will be ours." No one responds. Outside, the city hums with quiet anticipation. Trains clattering, factory chimneys smoking, schoolchildren marching beneath banners of the rising sun. Japan is alive with purpose. But the men in this room know the weight of what they are about to unleash. They do not yet realize that what they see on paper today will soon define the fate of their empire. The story of Japan's confrontation with the United States did not begin at Pearl Harbor. It began decades earlier in boardrooms, shipyards, and treaties inked with the illusion of equality. After World War I, Japan stood tall among victors. It had fought alongside the Allies and emerged with a modern navy, disciplined army, and ambitions far beyond its island borders. But beneath the pride was resentment. The Western powers, led by Britain and the United States, viewed Japan as a junior partner, a nation to be contained, not trusted. The Washington Naval Treaty of 1922 cemented that imbalance. It limited Japan's capital ships to a ratio of 5.5.3 against the US and Britain. On paper, it was arms control. In practice, it was humiliation. Japanese admirals, proud of their maritime achievements, saw it as proof that the West would never allow true equality. In naval academies from Yokosuka to Otajima, a new generation of officers studied the ratios with quiet anger. "If we are bound by numbers," one instructor told his cadets, "then we must surpass them in spirit, precision, and courage." Throughout the 1920s and 1930s, Japan transformed itself into a fortress of industry. Shipyards roared to life. The Mitsubishi and Nakajima companies perfected engines that would power the aircraft of the future. Young officers dreamed not of balance but of dominance, a Pacific empire that would stretch from the South China Sea to Hawaii. But ambition came at a cost. Japan lacked the very lifeblood of modern war: oil, steel, and rubber. These were controlled by the Western colonies, the Dutch East Indies, British Malaya, and above all, the United States. By the late 1930s, as Japan's armies marched deeper into China, Washington grew increasingly alarmed. President Franklin D. Roosevelt, once cautious toward Tokyo, began tightening the flow of resources. In July 1941, the United States froze Japanese assets and imposed a total oil embargo. For Tokyo, this was a death sentence. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the combined fleet, understood the mathematics of despair. "Without oil," he warned, "our navy will grind to a halt in a year." Yet he also grasped the deeper reality. Japan's leaders would never retreat from their expansionist dream. To them, surrender was dishonor. Survival demanded boldness. Thus, in the quiet rooms of Tokyo, the impossible was considered, a preemptive strike on the most powerful nation on earth. It would not be a war of attrition. Japan could not afford that. It would be a war of shock, speed, and spirit. Military theorists called it the Kantai Kessen, the decisive battle doctrine. Strike early, destroy the enemy fleet, and force a political settlement before American industry could awaken. The logic was desperate yet poetic. A sword drawn against a giant. By late 1941, as tensions deepened, reconnaissance units gathered every scrap of intelligence on the U.S. Pacific Fleet, then anchored at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. Japanese officers studied aerial photographs, ship silhouettes, and harbor depths. Every measurement mattered. The length of runway, the placement of fuel tanks, even the angles of morning sunlight across Battleship Row. For the Imperial Navy, this was not merely preparation, it was destiny. Tokyo buzzed with coded messages, and radio operators in darkened rooms tapped signals that would shape history. Orders moved quietly from the Naval General Staff to secret training bases in Kyushu and the Kuril Islands. There, carrier pilots practiced low-altitude torpedo runs, skimming over water so close that the spray kissed their canopies. Behind the precision and secrecy lay a deeper conviction that Japan could never coexist with the United States in the same ocean. Every admiral, every general, every pilot believed it in their bones. This was a war not just for territory, but for survival. The sun rose each morning over Tokyo Bay, bowsprit, its reflection gleaming on steel hulls, lined in perfect symmetry. Yet beneath that disciplined beauty, the empire was stepping toward a precipice. And across the Pacific, in the harbors of Hawaii, America's great battleships waited in peace, unaware that within weeks they would burn. Continue to Section 2 of Context der background. Initiated in 1940, the American Pacific Fleet was the centerpiece of the United States Navy. A symbol of deterrence, not aggression. Moored beneath the bright skies of Hawaii, its ships gleamed in formation. 8 battleships, 3 aircraft carriers, cruisers, destroyers, and submarines, each representing the industrial muscle of a nation that had not yet gone to war. To the casual observer, it looked unbreakable, but to Japanese naval intelligence, every fortress had a weakness. In a quiet building inside Tokyo's naval ministry, maps of Oahu hung on the wall beside photographs smuggled through diplomatic channels. Japanese consulates in Honolulu, operating under civilian cover, sent coded reports describing ship movements, schedules, and even the times sailors gathered for morning drills. The Americans, confident in distance, assumed safety. To them, Japan's reach seemed too limited, its carriers too few, its ambitions too far from Hawaii's shores. But to Japan's strategic thinkers, men like Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, Rear Admiral Minoru Genda, and Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, the Pacific was not a barrier, it was an open arena. Yamamoto, the architect of Japan's naval modernization, had spent years studying in the United States. He spoke fluent English, had attended Harvard, and once served as naval attaché in Washington. He had driven American cars, seen the lights of Los Angeles, and watched the endless factories of Detroit. More than anyone in Japan, he understood America's potential and its patience. That knowledge terrified him. In private letters to colleagues, Yamamoto warned that a war against the United States would be disastrous if prolonged. For 6 months to a year, he wrote, "I can run wild. After that, I can promise nothing." His words, calm yet foreboding, became prophetic. Still, the political tide in Tokyo drowned caution. The tripartite pact with Germany and Italy emboldened Japan. Nationalist newspapers spoke of a new order in East Asia, portraying Japan as the rightful leader of the Pacific. Within this atmosphere, the military hardened. Moderates were sidelined. And the idea of a preventive strike became policy, not fantasy. Inside intelligence circles, meticulous planning began. Analysts compared the operational readiness of both navies. They noted that while the United States had a larger industrial base, its Pacific Fleet was geographically exposed, spread between Pearl Harbor, Midway, and the Philippines. Its carriers, Enterprise, Lexington, and Saratoga, were powerful but limited in number. Japanese codebreakers and spies built detailed profiles of American ship captains, tactics, and even peacetime habits. Reports describe Pearl Harbor's depth as shallow, making traditional torpedo attacks ineffective. This challenge led Japan's engineers to design an innovation that would change history: the Type 91 aerial torpedo, modified with wooden fins to run true in shallow waters. Meanwhile, pilots of the First Air Fleet, Kido Butai, trained in strict secrecy. Every maneuver was practiced under simulation, from torpedo launches to dive-bombing sequences. Yamamoto demanded absolute precision. "Our first strike must be perfect. There will be no second." Across the ocean, American intelligence did notice signals, intercepted messages, shifting Japanese codes, diplomatic silence, but the dots were never connected. Washington expected aggression somewhere in Southeast Asia, not Hawaii. The idea of a full-scale carrier assault 4,000 miles away seemed beyond Japan's capacity. It was a fatal miscalculation. In late November 1941, as the carrier task force assembled in Haitakapu Bay under a shroud of snow and secrecy, Japanese generals reviewed the final reconnaissance images of Pearl Harbor. The photographs revealed ships aligned in peace, fuel depots untouched, and aircraft clustered in neat rows, perfect for destruction. One admiral reportedly muttered, "They sleep well. Too well." Those words captured the mood of an empire standing on the edge of destiny. From the skies over Tokyo to the calm waters of Oahu, the distance between preparation and catastrophe had narrowed to a breath. The Japanese generals and admirals were convinced America's Pacific Fleet was vast, powerful, and proud, but vulnerable in its confidence. And soon that confidence would ignite into fire and oil. The decision had been made. The ships had sailed. The rising sun was on its way across the Pacific. The human, tactical, and technological perspectives. The human angle, fear wrapped in honor. For Japan's military elite, the Pacific War was not born purely from ambition. It was born from fear disguised as honor. The nation had fought tirelessly for recognition since the Meiji Restoration. In half a century, Japan had transformed from a feudal kingdom into a world power, defeating China in 1895 and Russia in 1905. But each victory only deepened the West's suspicion. The League of Nations dismissed Japan's claims in Manchuria, American newspapers mocked its expansion, and European powers continued to treat Tokyo as an outsider to the white man's empire. This resentment brewed into determination. The samurai spirit, Bushido, became the ideological foundation of Japan's officer corps. It was not merely nationalism, it was survival of identity. To surrender, to bow before Western might, was unthinkable. By 1941, many senior officers genuinely believed that Japan was encircled by enemies who sought its destruction. "If we do not strike," General Tojo once said privately, "we will die slowly, strangled by embargoes." In their minds, war was not a choice. It was the only path left. And yet beneath the hardened resolve, there was quiet dread. Many Japanese admirals had studied in the United States. They admired American industry, its optimism, its vastness. Some even feared it. Yamamoto above all knew that the U.S. was not a sleeping nation. It was a giant resting before it moved. But by autumn 1941, no one could stop the tide. In the corridors of Tokyo, the culture of obedience left no room for hesitation. Once the emperor's seal was placed upon the plan, every man would follow. The tactical angle, the decisive battle doctrine. Japan's military doctrine at the dawn of World War II revolved around one powerful concept. Kantai Kessen, the decisive battle. Rooted in the lessons of Tsushima in 1905, when the Japanese Navy annihilated the Russians in a single climactic engagement, this doctrine became almost sacred. Its followers believed that victory would always come through one perfect, concentrated blow, a single battle that would decide the fate of nations. Throughout the interwar years, Japan's naval strategists envisioned such a confrontation with America. The plan was straightforward. Lure the U.S. Pacific Fleet westward across the ocean, exhaust it through submarine and air attacks, and then crush it in a grand fleet engagement near Japan's home waters. But by 1941, Yamamoto turned that doctrine on its head. Waiting for the Americans to come was suicide. He proposed the unthinkable, to strike first, across thousands of miles at the fleet's heart before it could even move. It was bold, it was beautiful in its audacity. It was also deeply flawed. Yamamoto's colleagues initially resisted. The risks were enormous. A carrier force operating so far from home, undetected, was unprecedented. But Yamamoto's authority was unmatched. He argued that Japan could not win a long war. It could only shock America into negotiation. "In the first 6 months in Hodonbi," he said, "we must win victories that will shake the world." The attack on Pearl Harbor became that calculated gamble, a tactical masterpiece designed to destroy morale and immobilize the Pacific Fleet long enough for Japan to seize the Philippines, Malaya, Hokkaido, and the Dutch East Indies. If executed perfectly, it would give Japan a temporary empire and a chance to negotiate from strength. If it failed, the empire would collapse. There was no middle ground. The technological angle. Precision. Through innovation, Japan's engineers, scientists, and naval tacticians worked in secrecy to make the impossible possible. One of their greatest triumphs was the adaptation of aerial torpedoes for shallow water use. The Americans assumed Pearl Harbor's harbor depth, less than 40 feet, made it immune to torpedo attacks. They were wrong. Japanese engineers fitted torpedoes with special wooden fins, preventing them from diving too deep. These innovations were tested repeatedly at Kagoshima Bay under strict cover, often using full-scale mock-ups of American ships. The result was the Type 91 torpedo, a weapon of astonishing stability and accuracy. Combined with armor-piercing bombs derived from converted battleship shells, Japan's strike capability had reached its peak. Meanwhile, Japan's fighter technology was also at its zenith. The Mitsubishi A6M0, a lightweight, highly maneuverable aircraft, had a range and agility unmatched by any American fighter of the time. Its pilots trained relentlessly, executing formation dives and dogfighting maneuvers with an elegance that bordered on ritual. Each pilot, before deployment, recited the ancient naval creed, "Duty is heavier than a mountain, death lighter than a feather." Technological superiority gave them confidence, but it also gave them illusion. The illusion that skill and spirit could overcome numbers and machines. Japan's naval aviators believed they could win through precision and courage alone. They did not yet understand that the enemy's greatest weapon was not its ships or planes, but its factories. As dawn approached on December 7th, 1941, the carriers of the First Air Fleet cut through the northern Pacific, a silent armada beneath gray skies. Every man aboard knew his role. Every weapon was tuned. Every calculation had been made. All that remained was the order to strike. Enemy perception, morality, and the psychological war. The enemy perception angle, misreading the giant. In the years leading up to Pearl Harbor, Japanese intelligence officers devoted immense energy to studying the United States. They read its newspapers, intercepted its communications, and observed its diplomacy with clinical precision. Yet for all their effort, one fatal miscalculation remained. They understood America's strength, but not its spirit. Many within Japan's high command believed Americans were soft. They saw a nation of consumers, distracted by luxury and wealth. Its military, they thought, lacked discipline and resolve. "They have machines," one Japanese general wrote, but no soul. This perception came not from arrogance alone, but from the lens of their own culture. In Japan, the warrior's identity, shaped by centuries of samurai tradition, valued sacrifice above life itself. To fight and die for one's emperor was the highest honor. To them, the democratic spirit of America, where citizens debated, criticized leaders, and avoided hardship, seemed weak. It was a tragic misunderstanding. Yamamoto, more worldly than most, warned his peers that American patriotism was quiet but unshakable. "You cannot measure a people's courage by their comfort," he said during one tense briefing. But few listened. The majority of the staff officers clung to their stereotype, an America rich, lazy, and unwilling to bleed. This blindness would become Japan's undoing, for when the attack came, it did not break America's will. It forged it. The moral angle, the weight of decision. Beneath the fanfare of nationalism, there existed moral unease, a private disquiet among certain Japanese leaders. Admiral Yamamoto himself confessed to a close aide, "In all my life, I have never seen anything so reckless as this war." He knew the plan was tactically brilliant, but strategically doomed. Yet duty outweighed doubt. He could not disobey the emperor, nor could he resist the political machine that had already chosen war. Other officers shared similar doubts, but buried them under ritual and hierarchy. Japan's military culture left no room for open dissent. The emperor's word was divine, and questioning it bordered on treason. Thus men of conscience performed their duties in silence. A handful of diplomats, including Ambassador Kichisaburo Nomura in Washington, tried desperately to maintain negotiations until the final moment. But their efforts were hollow. Tokyo had already dispatched the carrier strike force before the last diplomatic note was even delivered. In those final hours before the attack, a few Japanese officers wrote letters to their families. Some spoke of duty, others of regret. One pilot scribbled a line that would later be found in his locker. "If this fails, may Japan find wisdom in defeat." Morality, in the Japanese sense, was not absent. It was bound by obedience. They saw war not as evil, but as necessity, ordained by fate. The individual conscience was dissolved into collective purpose, and yet history would show that even within that obedience there were flickers of awareness, that what they were about to unleash would change humanity's course forever. The psychological angle. The burden of overconfidence. By late November 1941, the atmosphere within the Imperial Navy was electric, a mixture of pride, anticipation, and denial. Every officer knew that a single mistake could expose the entire operation. Yet optimism drowned fear. Years of propaganda had reinforced the idea that Japan's destiny was divine. Newspapers proclaimed that the empire's warriors were guided by the spirit of the gods. Radio broadcasts spoke of purifying the Pacific. In this echo chamber of certainty, doubts were treated as weakness. But behind the polished uniforms and rehearsed salutes, cracks began to appear. Some junior officers whispered among themselves, "Could Japan truly sustain a war against a country 10 times its size?" Others pointed out that Japan's industrial output was already stretched thin by the war in China. Still, the psychological machinery of war rolled on. Pride replaced prudence. The memory of Tsushima in 1905 still burned in the national psyche, proof they believed that divine fortune favored boldness. As the task force steamed toward Hawaii, its sailors felt a strange calm. They believed they were the chosen few, history's instruments of destiny. The sea was their ally, the storm their shield. Captain Mitsuo Fuchida, who would lead the attack, later recalled that the silence aboard the carrier Akagi was unlike any he had known. "No one spoke," he wrote. "Only the engines and the wind. We knew we were moving toward something greater than ourselves." That something greater was both glory and doom. The psychology of the Japanese military at that moment was a paradox. Supreme confidence shadowed by fatalism. They believed they would win because they had to win. There was no alternative, no retreat, no plan B. Every map, every strategy, every calculation rested on one fragile assumption, that America would not recover quickly enough to fight back. When they looked at the American Pacific Fleet, they saw might without resolve, iron without soul. They could not yet imagine that within 4 years those same ships would be rebuilt, multiplied, and sailing into Tokyo Bay. The stage was set, the fleets were in motion, and the world was about to awaken to a new kind of war, one fought not only with steel and fire, but with the conviction of nations. The sky over Pearl Harbor, December 7, 1941. Before dawn, the Northern Pacific was calm. The sea rolled beneath 6 carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, and Zuikaku, their decks lined with aircraft glinting faintly under the pale moonlight. Inside the lead carrier Akagi, Commander Mitsuo Fuchida checked his watch. 5 a.m., the order had been given. 10,000 meters to destiny, one pilot murmured as engines roared to life. The deck trembled. Waves of torpedo bombers, dive bombers, and fighters lifted into the cold air, vanishing into a gray horizon toward the south. From above, they looked like black arrows slicing through the mist. The first wave carried 183 aircraft, perfectly rehearsed, each man knowing his target to the second. Aboard Akagi, Fuchida stood by the signal lamp. The wind whipped his flight suit as he raised binoculars. Below him, Admiral Nagumo watched in silence, his hands clasped behind his back. There was no cheering, no shouting, only the steady hum of fate unfolding. As the planes vanished into the sky, Nagumo turned to his staff. "May the gods watch over them," he said quietly. Thousands of miles away in Hawaii, the world still slept. The waters of Pearl Harbor mirrored a perfect morning. Sailors played cards on decks, bands prepared for Sunday parades. The scent of breakfast drifted across Battleship Row, Arizona, Oklahoma, West Virginia, California, Tennessee, Maryland, Nevada. At 7:49 a.m., Fuchida's radio crackled. He had reached the skies above Oahu. Through breaks in the clouds, he saw the harbor below, peaceful, motionless, unaware. He gripped the transmitter and shouted the words that would echo through history. "Tora! Tora! Tora!" "Tiger! Tiger! Tiger!" The code for total surprise. Within seconds, the first torpedo planes dove toward the harbor. The whine of engines cut through the quiet morning. Bombs screamed downward. Torpedoes splashed into the blue and streaked toward the anchored battleships. The first explosions ripped through the water like thunder. Columns of smoke rose, followed by sheets of flame. At 7:55 a.m., USS Arizona took a direct hit from a 1,060-pound armor-piercing bomb. The ship erupted in a fireball visible for miles. More than 1,000 men died in an instant. The shockwave shattered windows across the base. Japanese pilots, trained for months, moved with chilling precision. Torpedo planes struck low, targeting the battleships. Dive bombers attacked the airfields at Hickam, Wheeler, and Ford Island, destroying American aircraft before they could take off. Fighters strafed the runways, cutting down fleeing soldiers. In just minutes, the harbor became an inferno. Ships listing, men leaping into burning oil, sky filled with black smoke and falling metal. From his cockpit, Fuchida watched the devastation unfold. "It was magnificent," he later wrote. "But I could not rejoice. It was too terrible, too real." At sea, aboard Akagi, radio operators received Fuchida's coded report. "Tenkai Seiko." Complete success. The bridge erupted in restrained relief. Officers bowed, some smiling faintly. Admiral Nagumo nodded once. "Begin preparations for the second wave." But beneath the calm, an unease stirred. Several staff officers urged Nagumo to launch a third wave, to strike the American fuel depots, submarine pens, and repair docks. Destroy those, and Pearl Harbor would be crippled for months. Yet Nagumo hesitated. Reports indicated the American carriers were not in port. Enterprise and Lexington were still at sea. He feared a counterattack. With his fleet already deep in enemy waters, fuel running low, and pilots fatigued, he chose withdrawal after the second wave. It was a decision made with caution, and it would prove fatal in hindsight. The second wave struck shortly after 8:45 a.m., attacking what remained. More bombs fell, more ships burned. But the core of America's naval infrastructure, its fuel reserves, dry docks, and carriers, survived. By 10 a.m., the sky was empty again. The last planes climbed north, leaving behind smoke, fire, and silence. At noon, aboard Akagi, officers gathered in the ready room. The reports were extraordinary. 18 American ships damaged or destroyed, over 2,400 killed, nearly 200 aircraft wiped out. For Japan, it was the greatest naval victory in modern history, achieved in less than 2 hours. When Admiral Yamamoto received the coded confirmation aboard the battleship Nagato, he stared at the telegram for a long moment. "The fleet has performed magnificently," his aide said. Yamamoto nodded slowly, then turned toward the sea. He whispered words that only a few heard, and even fewer understood at the time. "I fear all we have done is awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve." Around him, staff officers celebrated, but Yamamoto remained silent. He had studied America. He knew that this day, though glorious for Japan, might also be the beginning of its end. The sun was setting over Tokyo when the first news arrived. Crowds filled the streets in jubilation. Bells rang, flags waved, and the Emperor's voice broadcast victory to the nation. But in the quiet halls of the Imperial Navy, the celebration was thin, because somewhere in the Pacific the American carriers were still out there, untouched, invisible, and waiting. In the months following Pearl Harbor, Japan seemed unstoppable. Chudisuhua. From the jungles of Malaya to the coral shores of the Philippines, the rising sun advanced with precision and pride. Singapore once the Gibraltar of the East, fell in February 1942. British forces surrendered in humiliation. American troops on Bataan fought bravely, but starvation and disease consumed them. By April, the last defenders were forced to march, thousands dying along the road now known as the Bataan Death March. In Tokyo, parades filled the streets. Children waved flags, newspapers screamed victory, and the people believed the emperor's empire would last 1,000 years. Admiral Yamamoto, however, remained uneasy. He had studied in America, at Harvard, in the cafes of Boston, on the decks of U.S. battleships. He knew the American heart. "Give them 6 months or her Tortachiman," he told his staff quietly. "And they will strike back with vengeance." His words were not prophecy, they were memory. June 4th, 1942, the Battle of Midway. 4 Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, approached a small, insignificant atoll halfway between Asia and America. To Yamamoto, it was a trap meant for the Americans, but the trap had already been turned. Unknown to Japan, American cryptographers had broken their naval code. The U.S. Navy, led by Admiral Chester Nimitz, was waiting. At 4:30 a.m., Japanese planes took off to bomb the island. The attack seemed flawless, smoke rising from Midway's airfields, defenders scrambling. On Akagi's bridge, officers smiled in relief. Then as the recovery operations began, disaster struck. At 10:22 a.m., 3 squadrons of American dive bombers from the Enterprise in Yorktown burst through the clouds, almost unseen until the final moment. Fuchida, recovering from an earlier injury, would later describe what happened next as hell opening its mouth. Within 5 minutes, the pride of the Imperial Navy burned. A 1,000-pound bomb slammed into Akagi's flight deck, detonating fuel and munitions. Flames swept through the hangars, engulfing aircraft loaded with torpedoes. Kaga was next, hit by 4 bombs that turned her into a floating furnace. Moments later, Soryu erupted in a roar so violent that sailors were blown overboard. Within a single blinding span of minutes, 3 of Japan's frontline carriers, the same ones that had attacked Pearl Harbor, were gone. Admiral Nagumo aboard Akagi could only watch as his flagship burned. The decks that once launched victory now hissed with dying fire. On the radio, one pilot's final words came through static. "Tell my family, the sea is beautiful today." By noon, Hiryu, the last surviving carrier in the Jurios, launched 2 counterattacks, damaging the Yorktown but sealing its own fate. American bombers found her hours later. By sunset, she too was burning. 4 carriers, 300 aircraft, and nearly 3,000 men. Gone. The heart of Japan's naval power had been ripped out in a single day. When Yamamoto received the news aboard his battleship Yamato, he stared silently at the map before him. Every red pin that marked a carrier was now gone. He said nothing for a long time. Then with a faint voice, he spoke. "So, it is over." The officers around him did not understand. Japan still held territory from Burma to the Solomon Islands. But Yamamoto knew. War is not measured by land, but by time. The time had turned against them. Back in Tokyo, the news of Midway was softened for the public. Newspapers spoke of a strategic withdrawal. Photographs showed smiling pilots, heroic captions. But whispers spread through the Navy, of failure, of arrogance, of the gods abandoning their empire. Factories still produced aircraft, soldiers still marched, but the fire of inevitability had dimmed. By late 1943, the war that once seemed glorious became a slow collapse. The Americans and the sleeping giant, now moved with overwhelming force. Their new carriers filled the Pacific like moving cities. Their submarines strangled Japan's lifelines. Their bombers appeared even over Tokyo, raining destruction from the night sky. In the schools, children practiced with bamboo spears. In villages, rice was rationed, shoes were made from straw, and families listened to the emperor's voice for hope. Yet even in defeat, there was silence, a silence born of duty and denial. In one haunting moment in 1943, a naval officer visiting the ruins of Akagi's base on Hashirajima found a charred plaque on a wall. It read simply, "Pearl Harbor, the dawn of destiny." He turned it over and carved a new line beneath it with his knife. Midway, Tsantsiliuawai. The sunset of illusion. He left it there, nailed to the ashes of the past. Because deep inside every Japanese sailor, every officer, and every citizen, they knew that the war which began with pride at Pearl Harbor would now end only in ruin. The sea that once carried their empire would soon carry their surrender. After Midway, Japan still possessed courage, but courage could not build carriers nor fuel planes. The once proud Imperial Navy, now crippled, tried to mask its wounds with silence. Shipyards worked day and night, but materials were scarce, oil nearly gone, and experienced pilots irreplaceable. By 1943, American forces began to strike back across the Pacific. Island by island, reef by reef, they advanced with a rhythm as relentless as a tide. The Solomon Islands, Tarawa, Saipan, Guam, each became a graveyard of ambition. At sea, the U.S. Navy's new Essex-class carriers dwarfed anything Japan could field. Their Hellcat fighters cut through zeros like hawks through paper birds. Radar guided every move, code-breaking exposed every plan, and the skies that once belonged to Japan now burned with tracer fire and falling wings. Japanese generals began to argue, quietly at first, then bitterly. Army commanders blamed the Navy for losing Midway. Admirals accused the Army of draining resources into China. Each department fought its own war, while America fought one united campaign. In the ruins of Rabaul and the jungles of Burma, Japan's soldiers fought with extraordinary bravery, but bravery cannot halt mathematics. America's industrial power was now producing one aircraft every 5 minutes, one ship every day, and one bomb every second. The Japanese high command understood this truth in grim reports that crossed their desks daily. Yet still they clung to a single belief, that the United States, rich and soft, would lose the will to fight a long war. They were wrong again. By 1944, the U.S. IQ fleet launched the largest naval battle in history, the Battle of Leyte Gulf. 4 days of chaos, explosions, and kamikaze attacks turned the Pacific into a burning horizon. Japanese pilots, many barely trained, dove into American ships in waves of fire. It was courage without hope, sacrifice without strategy. When the smoke cleared, the Imperial Navy had ceased to exist as a fighting force. The once mighty Yamato, the pride of Japan, was ordered to beach herself in a final suicidal attack on Okinawa. She never reached it. American aircraft sank her in minutes, her decks torn apart by waves of flame. Admiral Toyoda's last message to his men was simple. The fate of the nation depends upon the spirit of its warriors. But by then even spirit had begun to fade. The home islands were under siege. Allied bombers roared over Tokyo, Osaka, and Nagoya, reducing entire districts to ashes. In March 1945, the Tokyo firebombing killed more than 100,000 civilians in one night, the deadliest air raid in human history. Rivers boiled, wooden homes vanished, and the sky itself seemed aflame. Still no one surrendered. The code of Bushido, the way of the warrior, bound every soldier, every mother, every child to endurance. To die was honorable. To live in defeat was shame. In underground bunkers beneath the imperial palace, the generals spoke in hushed tones. They knew the empire could no longer fight, yet no one dared say the word surrender. They waited for a miracle, for divine intervention, or for America to offer terms that would let them keep their emperor. But what came next was not a message. It was light, a light brighter than the sun itself. August 6, 1945. The morning dawned clear over Hiroshima, a quiet city of soldiers, students, and mothers preparing breakfast. Air raid sirens had sounded many times before, always false alarms. Few looked up when the lone B-29 appeared overhead. At 8:15 a.m., the bomb bay doors opened. A shape fell, small, silver, almost delicate. Then the world ended. A light so fierce that shadows burned into stone. A heat so intense that skin became flame. Buildings vanished, rivers boiled, silence followed. 80,000 people died in seconds. Tens of thousands more would follow. 3 days later, it happened again, and this time in Nagasaki. By then, the once mighty Imperial Navy was gone. The Pacific Fleet, that vast armada Japan had once mocked as clumsy and arrogant, now surrounded their islands like a wall of steel. American carriers floated off the coast, their decks filled with bombers. Battleships, Iowa, Missouri, South Dakota, all gleamed beneath the Pacific sun, untouched, invincible. Japan had gambled everything on one truth, that the Americans lacked the will to bleed for victory. But what they discovered far too late was that America's power was not in its ships or bombs, it was in endurance. Even in triumph, American sailors did not cheer. Many had seen the Pacific become a graveyard for both sides, but they understood what their victory meant. The fleet that had once burned at Pearl Harbor now stood as the instrument of Japan's surrender. Tokyo Bay was still that morning. Above the calm water floated the USS Missouri, its deck crowded with officers from every allied nation. Across from them stood the defeated delegation, Foreign Minister Mamoru Shigemitsu, in a top hat and cane, and General Yoshijiro Umezu, head of the Imperial General Staff. As they stepped forward to sign the document, the thunder of hundreds of Allied guns echoed across the bay. Above them, American planes flew in perfect formation, hundreds of them, the very symbol of what Japan had tried and failed to destroy. The ceremony lasted barely 20 minutes, but in that silence, an empire of centuries collapsed. General Douglas MacArthur spoke calmly. "It is my earnest hope that from this solemn occasion a better world shall emerge." When the ink dried, Japan's generals, men who once dreamed of conquest, stood motionless. For the first time in their lives, they bowed not as warriors, but as survivors. In the months that followed, interrogations began. American intelligence officers recorded hundreds of hours of testimony, quiet, polite conversations with men who had once commanded fleets and armies. Admiral Matome Ugaki, one of the last surviving senior officers, wrote in his diary before his final kamikaze flight, "We challenged a nation with the body of a whale and the heart of steel. I salute their courage and mourn our blindness." General Tomoyuki Yamashita, once the Tiger of Malaya, told his interrogators simply, "The American soldier fights not for emperor or god, but for one another. That is strength." And Admiral Shigeru Fukudomi, reflecting on the Pacific Fleet, said with haunting honesty, "We underestimated not their machines, but their unity. Each ship, each man, each bullet moved with one purpose. We moved with many." Perhaps most telling were the words attributed to a captured staff officer from the Imperial Navy's Operations Bureau. When we saw the American fleet at the end, so vast, so organized, so alive, we realized we had been fighting the ocean itself. Those words, carried in intelligence reports now declassified, became the epitaph of an empire. The Pacific War ended not in a single moment, but in the long silence that followed. Cities lay in ruins, oceans littered with wreckage, and millions mourned the price of pride. Yet from that silence 2 nations rose, one from ashes, one from victory, bound forever by the lessons of war. For Japan, humility replaced conquest. For America, vigilance replaced isolation. The Pacific, once a battlefield, became a bridge. The fleets that once faced each other in hatred would one day sail side by side in peace. In the decades that followed, Japan's surviving generals often spoke not of defeat, but of awakening. "We learned," one wrote in 1952, "that true strength is not forged in steel or strategy, or but in the courage to build, not destroy." And so the final words of this story belong not to admirals or presidents, but to the sea itself, calm, endless, and unjudging. Because when the waves of the Pacific roll across Pearl Harbor today, they carry no hatred, only memory. And beneath that memory lies the echo of what Japan's generals finally understood, that the power they feared in America was not in her ships,